All right, we're back. It is COMP3025 in the winter 2017 semester, and here at Georgian, and we are week 2, part 2 of our broadcast. Wow, we just took over an hour to get our certificates, right, through our certificate authority and everything else, to go up online, grab everything, download it, export it, do all that kind of work. Now, for some of you, was it long? Did you find this a long process? This is actually a short process compared to what we have. We're not really done. There's a couple things. If you were going to go take this a step further with iOS, right, and actually deploy stuff to iOS, you'd have to go and actually declare, kind of create this, all the stuff that I did for you, you'd have to do on your own as a developer. Plus, you'd have to create a deployment certificate for the App Store. Okay, so let's say you do it, you fix your app, and if you're going to do native iOS, you put it up and you kind of submit it to be approved by Apple. They would go and check it to see if it meets human interface guidelines. No joke. And within about a week or so, you should get an answer that either it's accepted or denied. And if it's denied, they'll give you a, kind of a little thing saying it doesn't meet guidelines. Please resubmit. Seriously. For the most part, if you've never done an app before, for the first time you're deploying and it doesn't meet human interface guidelines, getting a denial hurts, right? Because you're gonna have to go back, and sometimes you need to communicate with a bunch of times. Now in China, I gotta put this out there for people who are Asian and stuff, and I apologize in advance, okay? I'm not targeting anybody, right? In China, there is a phenomenon where they go out and they have teams of deployment people, and this is something of a phenomenon lately that Apple's trying to clamp down on, which is good. It's a good thing. And what they do is they submit the app 10 times. It's the exact same app, but slightly different names and signing certificates and everything else. Why do they do that? Why do you think they do that? Because someone has to approve it. That's why. It's a physical person that approves. It's not a machine that does the approval, right? So for the most part, there's sometimes what happens is 9 people, kind of decline and 1 person approves. Guess what happens to the app? It goes on the App Store and there's nothing to do. It actually saves time and money this way, believe it or not. From a time perspective, even if you pay $99 10 times, right? Who cares? Because at the end of the day, if you're deploying multiple apps to the App Store every day, you want to have you want to have the ability to do that. Now they're clamping down on this kind of stuff because they don't want that. They don't want you to go around their approval process, because not everyone is great on the approval side. On the Apple side, the quality assurance process isn't perfect because we're human beings, right? They try and do as best. They follow the process as best as possible. And if it's really blatant, like if it's some kind of blatant issue with your app, it's not going to go through no matter what happens. But sometimes it's something small that's, 2 or 3 people will say, no, it's not good. And other people will say it's okay. And the app goes through, right? So remember, there's different markets for app stores, both on Google Play as well as iOS. And depending on the market that we're talking about, some markets are massive. Like example, China. It's a massive market compared to here in the U.S. and Canada, right? We have a much smaller amount of people, so then it's not as crazy. And a lot of people have iPhones, especially in Asia, and that kind of stuff. Lots of Android phones too, but lots of iPhones. On the Android side, there's also an Android market, and there's also an Amazon market. Those are the big ones. There's also markets in India, and those kind of places as well. So when you go out, it's not just deploying your app to one market. Sometimes you want to deploy to multiple markets. And when you do that, there's a whole other signing process, that's involved. So this can be like just the certificate piece can take days, literally days and hours to set up, deploy, and all this kind of stuff, and wait for acceptance. So there's a whole process. Now, the certificates we generated together can be used for not just PhoneGap, but also to build games. If you're a gamer and you want to build a game with Unity, and again, I got to talk about this because if at the end of the day, we're going to have a small project at the end of this course, right? It's more of an assignment. But if in your assignment you wanted to build a game with Unity, you're perfectly welcome to do that, because it's, this is mobile and pervasive computers. If I go to unity3d.com for people who haven't seen it or have never looked at it, Unity gives a kind of a free game engine that you can work with. The deployment works great with iOS and Android, and I recommend using Unity if you're going to make a game with iOS and Android as opposed to doing something native. If you've never done any kind of OpenGL and you don't know C++ and so on, Unity allows you to do everything with C#, right, which is kind of cool. The other option we have is Unreal, right? Unreal, the Unreal Engine, as an example, that's the other option, right? Also allows you to deploy to iOS and Android. A little bit different in terms of certificates and everything else. The great thing about Android is you can do a self-signed certificate and get away with it. Just move on with a self-signed certificate. And iOS doesn't allow that. But for both iOS and Android, in order for you to run properly, unless you have a proper emulator, you need all the levels, all the APIs that are and the SDKs for the operating system you're going to be deploying to. All right? Because remember, the Android has multiple versions of their operating system, right? That they deploy to. And Apple, for the most part, they have full adoption, or most of their adoption happens on the latest build of their operating system. So, for example, iOS 10, a lot of people have already upgraded to iOS 10. Most people, in fact, right? Now, some phones can't update to iOS 10 or some older devices, and they got to stay back at iOS 7. There are a group of users like that too. But there's not a lot of users who hang out on iOS 9 and iOS 8. I'll tell you right now, not a lot. Right? Why? Because most people's phones, they last for 3 years in the Apple universe, and they buy a new one, or they upgrade, right? And then they get the latest version, iOS 10. Not so with Android. Android has all kinds of operating systems out there, and there's some really popular ones. If I was going to look up, the most popular Android operating system, Android, or popular Android OS, so popular Android OS, right? If I was to look that up. So there's some dashboards that allow you that tell you what the common distribution is. And you can see right now that version 6 has about 30% penetration. So that's API level 23. Lollipop is really popular still with 2 versions, 5 and 5.1, with about 33% penetration. KitKat, which is surprising, version 19 is still out there for a lot of phones. So you can see where the penetration is, like these 3 or these 4 APIs, right? So if we ever do Android anything, and for those people who want to do Android in this course instead of web, let's say you really want to do that, right? Please choose one of these API levels. Don't choose something that doesn't make sense. Don't choose API, don't choose Gingerbread, API 10. It doesn't make any sense. It's only 1% penetration in the market. And also the tools you get with Android and Android Studio are less. There's a lot other things you miss, right? Obviously, what you want to do is do something like this, Marshmallow, right? With level 6, version 6, or something like 21 or 22. You want to stick to these 4 from KitKat on. KitKat's very stable. I have to say that API level 19 is probably one of the most stable versions of Android out there, and it's still out there. That's why it's 22% penetration, right? Now, Android's used a code name that has something to do with a suite. As you can see, gingerbread, ice cream, sandwich, jelly bean, Kit Kat, lollipop, and so on. And they're going to continue to do that as they go. That's just their naming convention. Where iOS has boring names, iOS 10, right? iOS 9. They haven't done anything special with that. So keep that in mind. So if you're developing for Android, 4 APIs that you'd have to download right now, right? And how do I get those APIs downloaded? My recommendation is, if you're going to do that, download Android Studio, right? So if you download Android Studio, right? Here's Android Studio. Once you download this, it allows you to install all the APIs you want, right? Through your IDE. Your IDE itself is kind of a fully fledged development platform that allows you to manage your APIs and so on. By the way, those 4 APIs, they're going to be gigs of information. Don't expect those things to come down anytime fast, okay? Those things take time to download, and there's thousands of people downloading them all the time because of the the penetration of Android versus iOS. So put aside an hour or so of your time just for those 4 APIs, okay? Just FYI. So if you're going to download and install Android, and we're going to have to do that at some point in this course, okay? So that's that side. So that side, as we talked about, is native. You can deploy a different way. So again, when I give you an assignment, like the one I gave you today, assignment 1, I said, well, try and do it with Ionic or jQuery Mobile. What if you really wanted to do it with something else? And one of them would be Android or native iOS. What about Unity? Could you do it with Unity? Not sure that I would build a calculator with Unity. You could do it, and if you really made the case for it, I would probably say okay, right? I'm telling you right there. But let's talk about Xamarin Studio. So Xamarin Studio, again, back in, I believe, 2015, right? It was bought by Microsoft. So, and it's part of the whole Visual Studio universe now, right? Xamarin Studio. And what Xamarin does, it allows you to build cross-platform apps with C#, with Visual Studio. So if you're one of those kind of people, I'm okay with that too. If you're someone who wants to build cross-platform apps with Xamarin Studio, you know, you can certainly talk about that. Now, things I say you can, you're like, but Tom, are you going to teach us? I can only teach the web app part because of, like we talked about, access to the machines in front of you. Although what I'm seeing is that most of you should have access to run Xcode. So if you want to do a test in front of your machine, try and build an Xcode app. How do I do that? I search for Xcode. So if I go Command space on the machine in front of you, on the Mac in front of you, if you go Command space and you search for Xcode and you press Enter, it should bring up the Xcode IDE, right? And you should be able to launch an app, create an app like we did last week. I showed you a small app, a little silly app where you clicked on something. Even the machines in front of you, you should be able to build something and test it native on Xcode if you're on the Mac, okay? And it shouldn't ask you for anything. It looks like what they've done is they've listened to me and they've put on all the machines in developer mode. This is good. So you can develop with iOS applications. However, deployment is impossible. That's the other thing. If you want to actually deploy to a phone or something like that, or change one of those things, it looks like there's some other issues with this. Okay. Okay. Other frameworks. We talked about jQuery last week, so jQuery Mobile, and I said you can use jQuery Mobile for your app. And if you notice, jQuery Mobile is a very simple platform. And to get documentation for how to build this out, because I'm asking you to build an app, right? And if you want to know how, click on demos, right? If you click on 1.4.5, that's the latest version of jQuery, it gives you examples on how to do things like buttons and some code, right? So it gives you code on how to do buttons. If you actually look at view source for these two buttons here, it gives you the code on how to do the buttons for your user interface, right? And the other place that I recommended for jQuery Mobile was W3 Schools because it's fairly well documented. They have some really cool examples, very easy examples here in W3 Schools that you can get through. And we're going to cover some of this as we move forward. But if I don't cover something, a lot of it is covered right here, especially things like getting started. Getting started is cool. They give you an example page, and they get you going on jQuery Mobile. Okay, so remember, we're building web apps primarily in this course, but if you want to build something else, you can. Other options, Ionic, which is something we're going to be covering in this course. Ionic IO, we're not going to get to it yet. It takes a little bit more learning for us to get there. Ionic uses, it's actually quite interesting. If you look at their, from a developer perspective, you click on developers with Ionic, and you go to framework docs, right? They also have Ionic Cloud, just like PhoneGap Build. And if I go to setup and tutorial, it actually allows you to step through the Ionic setup, download using NPM, download and install Ionic and Cordova, right? And they give you an example app to follow, right, when it comes to the tutorial, right? So kind of, it tells you what to do and how the version works, right? Now Ionic is at version 2. And usually Ionic with version 2 also combines nicely with Angular 2, right? So in order for us to do Ionic, you need to know a little bit of Angular, so we're going to get to that as we get moving forward in the course. That's why I can't fully teach you everything about Ionic without Angular and TypeScript, right? So we're going to kind of review TypeScript today, a little bit of JavaScript, but I also want to give you a little bit of time. Looks like I'm running out of time to do a little bit of in-class, your user interface. So if you haven't started user interface, that's probably the thing you should be doing. I'm going to put up the PowerPoint later on that I have, that I'm building. Oh, by the way, one more thing before we move on. Ratchet. If I go to Ratchet.io, or it's actually Ratchet.com. Ratchet is another smaller framework. If I go to Ratchet.com, I believe, or Ratchet. Spell it. There we go. And GoRatchet.com. This is it. So if you go to GoRatchet.com, right? Ratchet is another framework, or if you will, or that allows you to use web technologies, right, to build applications. And you can download the example code. That's what they're giving you here. If you go to Getting Started, they tell you how to create pages, right? And you can combine. They tell you this is the application structure, what you get, how to set everything up, and you can see that there's CSS for both iOS and Android. And then what you can do, it's very, very quick setup. You can set up everything from fixed toolbars and everything else. They give you a basic template to work with, which is very jQuery mobile-like, to be honest with you, right? And it's very quick and easy, and it builds awesome, right? So Ratchet is another one. So Ratchet, jQuery mobile, Ionic. Those are the three web technologies we're going to be looking at, starting with jQuery mobile, okay? We did that a little bit last week. Questions about all that? I know there's a lot that I kind of touched in a few seconds, but I want to give you options. Whenever you get an assignment, like example, I might give you to build something of a game. We might do a game in this course, one, right? And I might say, well, you can build it in any framework you want. You can do a web game, small. You can do, and then deploy to PhoneGap, right? Because we're going to do the whole PhoneGap deployment. One of our assignments is going to be, how do I deploy to PhoneGap? Or how do I deploy to Cordova? That's going to be one of our assignments, right? Even if you want to do something else, I'm going to make you do at least one of those, all right? But after that, I mean, it's up to you what kind of framework you want to use. If you want to use Android native to build your own game at the end of this course, it's up to you. And I'll give you the option of building a game or doing a utility if you don't like games, right? So that way I'm not going to force you to do anything. I'm still going to mark you the same. There'll be an option. Okay, so let's take a look. So this is your basic template. So I'm going to put this up online later on, but I have a bit of a, like I said, a lesson that I want to go through when it comes to this. It's not that many slides, it's about 42 slides, but I'm not going to go through all of them. We talked about last week we talked about why go hybrid versus native. We talked about the challenges, and you saw a little bit more of that today, right? Because we just did an hour of setting up a certificate for iOS, right? And to get going, you don't really need that, right? If you just want to do a prototype without any kind of actual native build to anywhere, you don't need certificates. You just can do a web build, and you're good to go. We're going to talk about a little bit of JavaScript, the review. We're going to talk about some ES6 classes, and especially with TypeScript, because I want you guys to kind of review TypeScript a little bit. Again, I'm going to put this up on Blackboard later on. Again, I think one of the basic things is the difference between responsive design, which has been around for a while now. Now, it's not a new technology. You know, back when I first started here in 2011, it was just around the corner. 2011, 2012, responsive design was just really coming out, right? It was kind of an emerging technology. Now it's kind of mainstream. Everything we do with the web is responsive design, right? Bootstrap is a good example of that. It's a responsive framework, right? And there's other frameworks like Foundation, which is also a very nice responsive mobile-first framework. But the thing that we're doing here is we're taking a website and adapting it. It's more like adaptive layout to different viewport sizes. That's what we do with responsive design, right? And you can see that CSS3 media queries, which is the heart of responsive design, is really acceptable across different platforms, 94 or 95% penetration worldwide, which is kind of good, right? We use these kinds of queries. This is on the CSS side. And you can also do the same thing on the in the HTML file, where you can specify the media query. And that's the meat and bones of what Bootstrap does. But this is not mobile-centered design. This is saying, I want to adapt my design to hit different viewports. What we're talking about with jQuery Mobile, Ratchet, and Ionic is a mobile-first design without adapting layouts necessarily. It's not something that you would use, you know, to span across different kinds of viewports. It's specifically mobile, right? So why would you deploy that? You could actually do that without making a mobile app. Like I said last week, you could make it so that we use something called a user agent string. And if I was to look that up, right, we could use user agent string detection, right? That's what we want to try and do, right? And what it does is, I'll go to this one, user agent strings. It tells you what kind of browser is hitting your website. So depending on the type of browser, as an example, let's say, for example, I've got my browser that's coming in is this Apple WebKit, right, Gecko, and I'm using Chrome 55, right? That's what it is. So they're trying to identify what my user agent string is, and depending on what my user agent string is, it means that if I've got my desktop app, I'm coming from an Apple device. But what if I go from here? My mobile app browser, right, is got a different user agent string, right, than my desktop app. And if that's the case, I can detect it and serve a different kind of page altogether to my mobile device versus my desktop. Okay, so that's kind of one way of recognizing what kind of device it is. So imagine having a website where you have a subdomain m dot, let's say, I don't know, had some other kind of websites, pizza. You kind of want to go on pizza and you want to order a pizza, but you don't want to use the native app for some reason. Although I'll be honest with you, it's pretty good, right? And you want to go to their site. If you go with your app, it'll actually go to a subdomain that'll serve you up a mobile specific page, right? And there's a lot of other websites that do the same thing where they use something like a jQuery mobile, Ratchet, or Ionic to serve you up a mobile page that looks like an app and acts like an app, but it's a mobile, a web page. That's what it is, right? So that's another use for hybrid apps. You can actually make it so that it kind of responds to mobile without going native at all. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why that's what's different about that in responsive design. So responsive design is almost like if I was going to look at progressive enhancement, I would say I would do responsive design these days first. You have to make it so that all your websites are mobile compliant. That's like a given these days, right? And then mobile specific is the next level of progressive enhancement where you specifically serve up a page to those users that give you a user agent string that's mobile, right? And if it's something else, for example, a feature phone or something weird that accesses your web page, you can hit them with a responsive design. So you could do it that way as well. It really depends on the strategy of your company, the company that's building up the app. Okay, here it details different kinds of media queries. But when it comes to Cordova or PhoneGap, right, as an example, there's different kinds of aspect ratios that we're going to be talking about, right? And one of the challenges when we deal with not just Cordova, but any mobile platform, iOS or Android, is the idea that we have a different DPI of a screen. So example, back in the old days of iOS, we had an iPhone 4 or an iPhone 3. iPhone 3 had much lower resolution than an iPhone 4, right, with a Retina display, right? And then they came out with iPhone 6 later on, iPhone 5 and iPhone 6, and the more they came out with it, the denser the pixels. Same thing with Android. Android has nowadays a very dense pixel screen, right, compared to what it was before, right? So what happens is the images that we make on iOS and Android today are much higher resolution than the images we used to use back when iOS and Android started off. So we normally have more than one set of icons and images that we put inside of our resources. So I got to mention that as kind of a side effect of what we need to do. So here's some stuff that we can do to fix this issue. We can scale up. Now, why would scaling up, if you're going to have an image, is scaling up a good idea for an app to do? Would you scale up an image on an app? Was that the right thing to do? And the answer would be, for me, no. Generally, you don't want to do that. Why? Because of computational cycles, right? It's going to take computation time, if you will, or computer cycle time, to kind of spin up your image and scale it up. And also, when you scale up an image, you might get some pixelation, if you will, right? It's going to look pretty ugly, right? Always better to scale down than to scale up if you're going to scale it up. Much better to get a much larger image and then scale the way down, right? You can always change your layout, right? That's another way to deal with issues when it comes to images. So your layout kind of adapts to the image. Or you can do some kind of split view that takes advantage of the image size. So if you have an iPad, that might be a solution. Split the view, but you don't change your image size. That might be the way to deal with it. Another response might be, and this might be my response, would be make custom image sizes. An example would be make at least 3 for iOS. A standard image size, something that's 2 times, and something that's 3 times the resolution, And then you have those 3 image sizes that you can deal with different screen sizes. And it'll be the same, if not more complex, because you have extra dense, extra high resolution for Android. There's like 6 or 8 size classes, something like that for Android, right? So you can make all those images. I'd rather do it that and do all those images up front in a resource folder so that my app does not have to scale. Once you start scaling, now you're dealing with some performance issues. Okay? So some issues with that. Okay, let's not read that part. All right. So that's just some concepts, some theories about some of the challenges we're going to have, whether it's mobile specific or whether it's responsive. And again, as a default, as a fallback, you should always make your stuff responsive. Your websites I'm talking about. But when we're dealing with apps, like actual mobile apps, it's mobile first design. We don't care about responsiveness. We've gone beyond that when we go to that. We're making an app specifically to do a couple things. One, as a prototype for a real app, iOS or Android native, right? So let's say you might have a team of developers and you have a guy or a set of people who just do iOS or another people who just do Android. We talked about that last week. And the other one would be if you're making a hybrid app because you don't have the resources to hire these developers and you want to make a quick and dirty app for your application just to get you going, right? You can deploy it to both app stores. It's possible. Unlikely for iOS. I'll be honest with you, even with hybrid apps, unlikely that you get accepted the first time around, right? But you could do it. It's possible. So things to remember when it comes to JavaScript. There's some, when I put this up, there's some stuff to remember about data types. One thing is, even though we don't talk too much about data types in JavaScript, we need to work with JavaScript in this course, right? There is a string, a number, a boolean, an array, and an object. But JavaScript is loosely typed. It's not a strict type language, at least not yet. As we move toward ECMAScript 6, it's becoming more acceptable, the idea of strict typing as an option. And it's always going to be an option in JavaScript. And why do you think that is? Why would strict typing be an option in the future? Right? What do you think that would be? Anybody? Yeah. There's no backwards compatibility, right? And we want to make, for the most part, the Standards Commission, when it comes to doing JavaScript, always wants backwards compatibility for as much as possible, right? Otherwise, there's going to be some websites that'll just break. It'll break the build, right? We don't want that. Which means we're never going to have 100% adaption, at least not for now, with typing, strict typing in JavaScript as a standard. We may have it as an option that you can turn on or off, but not as a standard. And TypeScript helps us with that, right? Okay, typically we would do things like alerts and writes. And I'm going to tell you that these two things are the bane of JavaScript developers. Please do not use document.write or any kind of window.alert, an alert in JavaScript, especially for mobile. First of all, it won't work properly, right? It could break your application. And that's not a great way of testing. The best way to test an app is through a browser and using some kind of inspector. If it doesn't work on the browser, it's not going to work on your phone, chances are, right? So that's something to note. So when it comes to testing, we're going to do this less and less. And typically in JavaScript, you do document.getElementById to attach to some kind of element on the screen. But with the frameworks we're using, with Ionic, or with jQuery Mobile, or with Ratchet, you're not going to do this much, right? The JavaScript on the back end of your files that we're going to be talking about is for the logic that you're going to build in for your calculator. That's the kind of JavaScript I want you to do. And it's going to be more of event handling with buttons than anything else. You may need to do this to get a reference to the button, just to create that event handler, right? But remember that when you use jQuery, you have access to, or jQuery Mobile, you have access to jQuery, and then you don't have to do document.getElementById. Who knows what the equivalent is as a review in jQuery? What's the guys? Sorry to interrupt you guys. What is the equivalent of document.getElementById in jQuery? Does anyone know? Yes. Right, and then .click, let's say, right? If it's a click event. So we need to do somehow, whether you do it with document.getElementById and then as to get a reference and then create the event handler afterwards, that's one option, or whether it's with jQuery, you need to do it that way. Somehow get a reference to it and then create the event. Okay? And when we get right into events, this, my friends, this thing right here, please never do this. Why would I never want to do this? This is like bad form, right? Because I'm doing my JavaScript inline. I never want to do my JavaScript inline, and I mean never. It's bad form for us. And when it comes to PhoneGap and Cordova and everything else we're going to be using in the future, it might break it might not work the way you want it to work, right? Much better to have a separate file for your JavaScript and jQuery files, right, than to do it this way. And it's only that page specific. If I want to reuse that or have a shared event handler, that's not going to do it for me right here. Right? It's not a great idea. Because if you notice, it kind of gets the reference to this thing and then does some kind of event. And most of the time I say no. How many people have done prototypical inheritance with JavaScript? Anybody? A little bit. This is the old way to do it. You know, the way to do it is to create a function that looks like, almost like a constructor. This is what it would look like. So you've got your function person, in this case, and I kind of went over this last week a little bit, where you've got your first name, last name, age, and eye color. Here's some information here. When we use the this keyword, we attach properties. As soon as I assign a property in JavaScript, it creates the property for you of that object. It uses prototypical inheritance to do this, right? So this is the way we do it in JavaScript. But we're moving away from that because we're using the class syntax. We create a class and use the constructor syntax to do this. So again, just a real high-level review of some concepts in JavaScript. When we use jQuery, jQuery is much more used. And you know what? Most of the time when I use jQuery, I use it for Ajax. All right, typically. And a lot of the times I use jQuery, I only use it for a quick hit. I want something to happen, like a document ready, you know, one of those kind of things, event. I don't typically use jQuery for searching and using it for CSS because I can do most of that with Query Selector All with JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, which is actually faster than jQuery. jQuery, you have to download the library, load it, and use it. And with JavaScript, I can do a lot of it on my own, right? But Ajax, I can't say that there's anything better. If you're going to do any kind of Ajax, loading a JSON file or something like that, jQuery makes your life a lot easier, all right, in general. And it talks here in the PowerPoint on how to load jQuery and how to attach it. We need to use the $. That just basically is a shorthand for jQuery, where we say jQuery, whatever the selector is, and the action. We can do chained actions and promises with jQuery and all kinds of other stuff. I'm not going to talk about too much about this. Where I really want to get into the meat and bones of it before we depart. I know we're at the end of our day today, and I apologize for the delay, but we need the certificate part just ate us, right? Which I knew it would. TypeScript is kind of that superscript, almost a superset of JavaScript. And what it does is it allows us to be strict with typing. And some people, I mean, again, as a review, some people hate TypeScript because they're like, well, hold on. I like the fluidity and the flexibility of JavaScript, and I don't want to make my stuff strict because that limits my creativity. It makes me use object-oriented design with JavaScript, and it was never meant for that. That's the argument, right? On the other side, people say, well, I want to use JavaScript in an object-oriented manner because it's more organized. It doesn't look like spaghetti code. And you know what? I can convert it to ECMAScript 5, the previous version of JavaScript, and it would work cross-browser, but I can use best practices that I learned from Java or C# or even C++, right, to kind of program JavaScript, which is better for developers, right? So typically when I make an application, I use TypeScript. Okay, now, when I use TypeScript in the application itself, there's a couple things I can do, right? One, here we're talking about how do I convert. There's two ways to convert or cast an object, because we need to, going back to the data types, these data types are the ones we use in TypeScript. We can be as strict. By the way, we want to not do any as much as possible. Any, every time I use an any data type when I declare anything in JavaScript, it is a fallback from a compatibility issue perspective. If I can't figure out what the data type is going to be, I'm going to use any, but only very briefly. And then I'm going to try and figure out what the actual type is going to be that I'm going to use. If I start using any, I might as well not even use TypeScript at all. That's like saying it's an any type. I can do anything I want with it, right? But going back to this, sometimes we need to convert from one kind of data type to the other. And the way to do that is in JavaScript, TypeScript, you can use angle brackets. Actually, it's the same thing with some other languages. You can see in Java and in C#, we can always do the same thing as well. So if I use angle brackets, in this case string, I can convert a variable from some kind of number to a string in TypeScript. And what it does is it says, hey, now I'm telling you that this is a string. I can also use the as keyword. And by the way, as is compatible with Swift and C# and Java. There's a lot of, you can use as, it's a common keyword nowadays for the latest version of those languages, to also convert or to represent this value as a string as opposed to whatever it was before, number or something else. Last week we kind of talked about this as well, but I'll say it again. We can use let and const, which is better for us with TypeScript, and it's got good compatibility with JavaScript. So that's part of the stuff we talked about before. And this is a pretty decent example of a user that we want to create we want to create a greeter function. This is kind of right off the website. If you actually go to the website, they make it do a greeter function to do that. But this is really where the meat and bones of it comes in. I'm just going to zoom in here before I let you guys go, because we're going to be talking about this over the course of the next little while. And when I put this PowerPoint up, I want you to look at this. Normally, I use interfaces as a handshake, almost like an agreement in C# or Java, to say, hey, when I use an interface, that means that your class that adopts or implements the interface agrees to use properties or these methods that are kind of outlined in the interface. And yes, you can do the same thing with TypeScript. However, what if I want to make a custom type? Some people might want to make it with a class. But the thing with the class is it's a little bit overkill. All I'm making a custom type for a lot of times in TypeScript is code hinting. I want to get code hinting from my objects, right? Interfaces are a great way to do this. It's a zero-sum game when it comes to interfaces. It doesn't add any overhead to your JavaScript when it converts over. So if you convert from TypeScript to JavaScript, interface, gone. There's no interface because there is no data types in ECMAScript 5, right? Because we're going to still go back to that. But you can do something like this. You can say in the class student, instead of saying, my first name and my last name are type strings, I could say my class student is of type person, right? And instead of how it says implements person, right? Notice that I'm forced to put in first name and last name. I don't have to do that. I can actually declare person with a lowercase p as person, the interface. And it'll actually allow me to put that data type, and it'll automatically have two properties, first name and last name. So that's another way to do that. And to see that really quickly, if I go to the playground up on line, and then I'll let you guys go, for interfaces, if I go to TypeScript, and on the playground here, right, you can see that I've got a person class already, right? But the person class might have a name, right? A name and an age, right? Well, I can create an interface up here where I have a, let's say, for example, instead of my class being the person, this one up here, I can leave this whole thing out. Let's take my public says hello function for a second. I can cut this out, and I can put this back in here, right, in my student for a second, just for this example. And instead of my public name and public age string being something, I can make this into an interface where I have a name, right, which is a string, and I have an age, which is a number. And then instead of extending the person class, I wouldn't do that here. I could declare a variable of type person. I have to name the interface. I have to declare a variable of type person, which I can make private, and which is of type person, right? And once I do that, you can see that it wouldn't be this .name that I would be handling. It would be this .person.name, right? And this .person.name down here. Now, what does it do on the right side? Let me show you what it does on the right side. So once I've done this, notice that it's converting automatically, and there's one error, right? Here's the error right here, because I'm creating a new person. I don't want a new person. I want a new student now. There is no person. And I'm passing in the name of my student, which is here, and my age and a student ID, because I'm missing the student ID. That's why it's giving me code hinting. So student ID might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever it's going to be, right? And now you can see what the difference is on the right. Do you see an interface on the right? There's nothing. That's what it converts to. So you can see that it actually has a lot less code than if I used inheritance and if I use a class to represent the person altogether, right? The person type. So interfaces are really cool, something that we use with TypeScript a lot, especially when we need to kind of create something that is just for us for code hinting, right? As opposed to creating new classes altogether, right? Questions around this? Okay, next week, what I'm expecting is when I come in, I want to see your user interface. I tried to give you a little bit of time today. I know we kind of ran out of time. We did some certificates. Please have your user interface ready to go for your assignment 1 by next week. I'm going to check you, right? So I'm going to go around and see if your user interface is done. If it's done, you're going to get a bonus mark. If it's not done, you're going to miss out on an easy mark, right? So please get that done and be ready for me to see it next week, okay? It's going to be a lab that I'm going to do. I'm going to put it up. I'm going to go around and check. If you've got it, you're going to send it up as a screenshot of your interface. That's what you're going to do. And when you set it up, you get a free bonus mark, okay? Any questions around today? What we covered? More of the same, right? A little bit of review, and next week we'll get right into it, okay? No more certificates. Thanks a lot, guys. See you next week.